18 hours. That's all it took for Marcus to realize he wasn't just in jail. He was in a place where fear lived in every shadow. The screams coming from the end of the hallway, the guard who turned away at the worst moment, and the inmate who whispered to him, "Welcome to Rikers. You won't last a week." This is a true story. Welcome back to the channel. Today's story is one of the darkest I've ever covered. This is what really happens inside Rikers Island, and what one man had to survive just to stay alive.
This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. All events are dramatized respectfully based on public information. No violence is shown or encouraged.
Now, let's go back to where Marcus's nightmare began. The moment he stepped onto the island that would test every part of him. The cold wind cut across Marcus's face as the ferry pushed through the dark water. He stood near the railing, trying not to stare at the massive concrete island rising ahead of him. Rikers Island. Even from the distance, it didn't look like a jail. It looked like a warning. Fog curled around the guard towers. Spotlights swept across the water. Barbed wire glinted like wet teeth under the early morning light. Every other inmate on the boat stayed quiet, clutching their chains, staring down at their shackled hands. Marcus wasn't supposed to be here. A misunderstanding. That's what he kept telling himself. A fight at a party. A broken bottle. A man who got hurt worse than anyone expected. But misunderstandings didn't matter on Rikers Island. Only survival did. As the ferry docked, a guard shouted, "Keep your eyes forward, no talking." Marcus swallowed hard. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. This was the moment his life split into two. Before Rikers, and everything after. Inside the intake building, harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead. A long metal bench ran along the wall where dozens of men sat, tired, silent, defeated. The air smelled like sweat, bleach, and something metallic Marcus couldn't place. Guards barked orders like drill sergeants. "Shoes off, hands on the wall, look straight ahead." Marcus felt eyes on him. Not the guards, the inmates. Some stared with boredom. Others with curiosity. A few with something darker, like they were picking out their next target. They stripped him down, checked his hair, his mouth, his feet. A guard muttered without looking up, "You look nervous." Marcus forced a breath. "It's my first time." The guard gave a short, humorless laugh. Everybody's scared their first time. The problem is, some people stay scared. Another guard shouted, "Inmate Roberts, step forward for housing." That was him. Marcus stepped into a dim hallway where the buzzing lights seemed to hum like insects. The deeper he walked, the colder the air felt, like he was walking underground. A metal door clanged open. "Welcome to Rikers," a guard said without a hint of welcome. Marcus's new cell wasn't a room. It was a cage made of old concrete, peeling paint, and shadows that always seemed to move. A thin mattress lay on a metal cot. A tiny barred window let in a slice of blue-gray light. The toilet sat in the corner, fully exposed. He stepped inside slowly, like walking into a lion's den. The door slammed behind him, and the lock clicked. It echoed in his chest. He sat on his cot and tried to calm his breathing. Far down the hallway, someone was screaming. He couldn't tell if it was anger, fear, or pain. Somewhere else, metal clanged against metal. Someone laughed, but the laugh didn't sound happy. Marcus leaned his head against the wall. He told himself he'd get through this. A few months. Good behavior. Keep your head down. But then he heard footsteps. Soft. Slow. Getting closer. He looked up. Marcus froze. A man stepped into view,
Tall, wide shoulders, tattooed arms, eyes that didn't blink. He leaned casually against the bars like he'd visited 1,000 cells before. "So, you're the new guy," the man said quietly. Marcus's mouth went dry. "Yeah." The man smiled a slow, cold smile. "You picked the wrong place to look scared." He tapped a knuckle on the bars. Tap, 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 like counting down. Then he whispered, "Tonight, we'll see what you're really made of." The footsteps faded as he walked away, but his words stayed hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus's stomach dropped. Tonight? What was happening tonight? He tried to steady his breathing, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. Far down the hallway, a metal door creaked open. An alarm buzzed. The lights flickered. And then, from the opposite end of the corridor, Marcus heard another voice call his name. A voice he wasn't expecting. A voice that made everything even worse. "Roberts, they want you in the yard." Marcus stood up slowly, heart pounding. Something was waiting for him out there. Something he was not ready for. The yard at Rikers Island wasn't like anything Marcus had imagined. From the ferry, it looked like a fenced patch of concrete and grass. Up close, it was a living machine of fear, tension, and silent rules that no one dared break. Guards leaned against the perimeter fences, seemingly bored, while inside, every movement, glance, and gesture carried meaning. Marcus stepped out from the cell-block corridor, the heavy steel doors clanging behind him. The sunlight, or what passed for sunlight through the high concrete walls, fell harshly across the yard. He could feel eyes on him instantly, scanning, calculating, weighing him. Some glanced with curiosity, others with contempt, a few with the predatory interest of someone who had survived this place far too long. He kept his head down, walking cautiously toward the center of the yard where the new inmates were assembled. Marcus could already sense the unspoken hierarchy. The bigger men walking slowly, arms tattooed with gang marks, seemed to own the space without ever saying a word. Smaller groups clustered in corners, whispering, shifting, like predators sizing each other up. And then he felt it, a sudden sharp tension in the air, like static electricity before a storm. Two inmates in the middle of the yard, leaders of rival groups, locked eyes across the open space. The air seemed to hold its breath. Everyone around stopped moving for a moment. Marcus froze mid-step. He'd read about these standoffs, but seeing it live, it was terrifying. The taller of the two stepped forward, cracking his knuckles deliberately. The other responded with a slight smile, tilting his head, unblinking. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the entire yard could explode into violence. Then a whistle pierced the air. Guards shouted and motioned them apart, but Marcus could feel the aftershock. Every inmate in the yard now knew he had been there, observing. He was marked in a way he didn't yet understand. Marcus's thoughts raced. How did you survive this? How do you avoid becoming the target without showing weakness? Every step forward, every glance, every motion had to be calculated. He tried to remember Joseph's words, move carefully, observe constantly, and never make your fear obvious. Then it happened. A ball, just a small, worn basketball, was kicked across the yard toward Marcus's feet. He froze, uncertain, until a grinning inmate shouted, "New guy, catch it if you can." It wasn't an invitation to play. It was a test. Marcus bent instinctively, catching the ball, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. The crowd murmured approval, a low, appreciative hum that sent a strange chill through his body. One test passed, but it was only a test. There would be many more. Marcus walked carefully toward a bench along the wall, trying to find a safe place to sit. That's when he noticed it. Small, almost imperceptible signals being exchanged between the inmates. Hand gestures, the tilt of a head, the tapping of feet.
invisible language controlling the yard. Marcus's heart pounded. Understanding this was survival. Ignoring it could be deadly. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in his peripheral vision. He turned to see a tall, muscular man leaning casually against the wall, eyes tracking every move. Tattoos ran along his arms and neck, gang insignias that Marcus couldn't decipher, but instinctively feared. His gaze lingered on Marcus, and then he nodded subtly. Marcus exhaled a little. That nod meant something. Perhaps respect, perhaps warning. He didn't know, but it was better than ignored.
Marcus moved to the bench, trying to look casual. His mind, however, was racing. Every instinct screamed, alert. He watched the other inmates carefully, noticing patterns, the way some avoided certain areas, the quick glances exchanged before a scuffle, the silent agreements that dictated who could move where. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the yard wasn't just a place for exercise. It was a battlefield of strategy, power, and psychological warfare. Hours passed. Marcus endured the sun beating down, the endless scrutiny, and the subtle threats that lurked in every corner. He learned quickly that showing hesitation made you a target, but showing arrogance made you a challenge. Walking the line between fear and confidence was exhausting. Then came the moment that would define the first day, a sudden commotion at the far end of the yard. Two inmates began shoving each other, voices raised, fists ready. Marcus instinctively stepped back, trying to disappear into the shadows of the bench area, but the fight escalated. The taller inmate, the one who had nodded earlier, shoved his opponent hard, sending him sprawling onto the concrete. The entire yard tensed. Marcus's heart thumped violently as the smaller inmate struggled to rise. The tall man approached slowly, circling like a predator. He could see the other inmates parting slightly, giving the man space, their eyes wide with anticipation. He felt frozen in place, trapped by the tension, and yet he couldn't look away. The moment seemed endless. And then, unexpectedly, the tall man stopped, grabbed the fallen inmate's shoulder, and shoved him lightly aside, not violently, just enough to assert dominance without causing serious harm. He turned slowly, scanning the yard, and his eyes locked on Marcus. A slow, calculated smile spread across his face. Marcus realized what the entire day had been teaching him. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about reading the room, understanding the unspoken rules, and knowing when to move and when to stand still. One wrong step, one wrong glance, one misread gesture, and you could find yourself on the floor, or worse. By the time the guards blew the whistle to signal the end of yard time, Marcus felt as if he had aged years in a single afternoon. He walked back toward the cell block, exhausted but alert, replaying every movement, every interaction in his mind. Each one was a lesson in survival. As he reached the corridor leading to his cell, he heard a whisper. "Nice moves out there, rookie." He turned quickly, but saw no one, just the shadows shifting along the walls. Marcus swallowed hard. Someone had been watching him the entire time, assessing him. The realization hit him. No matter how careful he was never truly alone on Rikers Island. Back in his cell, Marcus slumped onto the cot, muscles sore, mind racing. The sunlight faded, replaced by flickering fluorescent lights. The quiet of the evening was eerie, almost unnatural. He had survived the first day, but he knew it was only the beginning. And then he heard it, the faintest sound at the door, a scratch like fingernails on metal. Marcus froze. His pulse quickened. The shadow had returned. Something was coming. And it wasn't just the darkness. It was someone or something that had been waiting for him. The first day of survival at Rikers Island was over. The real challenge was only beginning.
Marcus sat on the cot, heart still pounding from the whispers and the scratch at the door. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, throwing long shadows across the cell, and every small sound seemed amplified. The hum of the prison's ventilation system, the distant clatter of metal doors, and the low murmur of voices from the corridors outside all pressed in on him like a heavy fog. He had survived the yard, learned the unspoken rules, and even earned the subtle nod from the tall inmate who had dominated the fight earlier. But now, in the isolation of his cell, the weight of everything he had seen and experienced began to settle in. Every face, every gesture, every glance from earlier replayed in his mind, forming a mental map of danger, alliances, and hidden threats. A sudden clanging echoed from the corridor, not a door, not a gate, but the metallic scrape of something being dragged across concrete. Marcus stiffened. His ears picked up subtle footfalls. Deliberate, slow, deliberate. Someone was coming. He instinctively pressed himself against the far wall, trying to blend into the shadows. The door to his cell creaked open just a crack, enough for a sliver of shadow to spill into the room. Marcus held his breath. A figure stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with tattoos snaking up his arms. It was the same inmate who had watched him in the yard, the one who had nodded in approval. "Rookie," he said softly, almost kindly, though his eyes remained cold and unreadable. "You've got potential, but potential can get you killed here if you're not careful." Marcus swallowed. I'll learn." His voice sounded smaller than he felt. The man leaned closer. "It's not about learning fast. It's about surviving long enough to even get the chance to learn. Remember, the shadows are always watching, and sometimes they move faster than you expect." Before Marcus could respond, a loud bang echoed from down the hall. The tall man's expression tightened. "That's your cue. Listen carefully. Everything you hear tells you a story. Pay attention." He stepped back into the shadows, leaving Marcus alone with the silence, broken only by the distant hum of the prison. Later that night, Marcus was escorted to the yard for evening exercise. The air was colder now, heavy with the metallic smell of the prison. The sky was dark, but faint moonlight filtered through the tall fences, casting blue shadows across the cracked concrete. A few inmates lingered in corners, talking quietly, but most were silent, their eyes scanning constantly for threats. Marcus moved cautiously, keeping his hands visible and his body language non-threatening. He remembered the first day, the tests, the subtle challenges, and the silent hierarchies. Tonight, he knew, he would face another kind of test. A group of inmates began circling a smaller man, muttering under their breath. Marcus's stomach sank. He watched as one of the larger men shoved the smaller one against the wall. The man fell, scraping his elbow, but quickly got back up, raising his chin in defiance. The larger inmate laughed, almost mockingly, before a guard's whistle cut through the night. The circle broke, but Marcus noticed the unspoken rule. Power is displayed, observed, and remembered. He took a deep breath and scanned the yard. His eyes caught movement, a shadow slipping along the far fence. It was fast, deliberate. Someone was watching him, studying his reactions, testing him silently. Marcus forced himself to stay calm, mimicking the posture of the experienced inmates around him.
As Marcus walked toward a bench near the wall, a voice called out behind him. "Hey, new guy." He turned to see a shorter inmate with a cocky smirk, stepping closer. Marcus's instinct screamed caution. He had learned quickly that even small challenges could escalate. "Don't take up space you don't own," the inmate said, his tone playful but edged with menace. "We're watching you, always." Marcus nodded, keeping his voice steady. "I'll remember." The man laughed softly. "Good. You might last a little longer than most rookies." As the inmate walked away, Marcus realized something important. Even small interactions carried weight. Every word, every gesture was recorded in someone's memory. Every move could either protect him or mark him for trouble. Then came a sudden commotion near the center of the yard. Two groups collided, shoving, yelling, fists raised. Marcus instinctively stepped back, but the fight spread, and suddenly he was caught in the midst of chaos. A flying elbow knocked him against the wall, and he felt the sting of concrete against his shoulder. His first instinct was to fight back, but he remembered the advice whispered earlier: survive first, learn later. He ducked, twisted, and moved toward the edge of the yard, keeping low and blending into the shadows. The fight erupted around him, but he stayed calm, breathing slowly, observing. By the time guards intervened, Marcus was unharmed, unnoticed, almost invisible. Back in his cell, Marcus tried to calm his racing heart. The yard had been a trial, a lesson in observation and patience. He replayed every moment in his mind, noting the gestures, the pauses, the subtle signals exchanged between inmates. He realized that Rikers Island wasn't just a prison, it was a system of social rules, hierarchies, and psychological warfare. Then he noticed movement outside his cell. A shadow slipped past the bars, stopping just long enough for Marcus to catch a glimpse of a hand signal. 3 taps on the wall. Marcus froze. That was a signal he had seen before in the yard, a warning, or maybe an invitation. He didn't know which, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the corridor, "Marcus, don't trust the quiet ones." He spun around. No one was there, only shadows stretching across the walls, flickering with the faulty light. Marcus's pulse quickened. Every sound, every shadow now carried a threat. He realized he wasn't just learning about the prison, he was learning about himself. How far could he push his instincts, his patience, his courage? And how far would Rikers push him? Hours passed, and the cell block grew quiet. The other inmates were asleep, or pretending to be. Marcus lay on his cot, trying to process everything. Then the lights flickered and dimmed, leaving the corridor outside in a deep blue shadow. He heard it, soft footsteps, deliberate and slow, coming closer. His body tensed. The tall inmate from the yard appeared at the doorway, but this time he wasn't smiling. He leaned against the metal frame, silent, and Marcus felt the weight of the gaze piercing through him. "You've done well to survive so far, but tomorrow the real test begins, and I promise you won't see it coming." The footsteps receded, the door clicked shut, silence returned, but Marcus couldn't move. Every nerve in his body screamed that this was only the beginning. He sat on the cot, heart racing, staring at the shadows that seemed to shift and stretch across the walls. The first day had been a challenge, the night had been a warning, and now, with a new day coming, Marcus realized the shadows weren't just around him, they were inside him too. The next day, he would learn how deep Rikers Island could get under your skin.
Marcus woke to the cold gray light of dawn filtering through the small barred window of his cell. Every muscle ached from yesterday's yard chaos, his mind still buzzing from the psychological lessons he had absorbed. The first night had been a warning. The second morning promised a real test. He could feel it in the way the shadows stretched across the concrete walls, in the faint murmurs echoing from the corridors. He dressed slowly, each movement deliberate. Every step, every glance, every sound was now calculated. This was no longer about fear, it was about vigilance. He walked toward the cell door as the heavy lock clicked open. The tall inmate from yesterday's yard appeared again, standing in the corridor like a sentinel. You survived day one, but today it isn't about surviving the yard. Today, it's about surviving yourself. Marcus swallowed.
uncertainty gnawing at his stomach. "What do you mean?" The inmate didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the yard. Marcus followed, heart racing. The yard was quiet compared to yesterday, but that was deceiving. Inmates moved with purpose, a silent language dictating who could walk where and when. Marcus immediately noticed that the groups had shifted overnight. Alliances had changed. Dominance had been reasserted. Every man he had seen yesterday now seemed sharper, more dangerous, more aware. Marcus's first instinct was to stay on the edges, but he quickly realized that the perimeter was a trap of its own. The bigger men positioned there were hunters, not protectors. The central area, surprisingly, was empty, but that too was a challenge. He had to choose his space carefully, for every step was observed, every movement measured. He kept his eyes on the taller man who had been watching him from the start. He nodded once toward Marcus, signaling something. Marcus didn't know if it was a warning, approval, or a challenge, but he understood one thing. Today, the yard itself was a teacher, and he was a student who could not afford mistakes.
By mid-morning, Marcus began observing more carefully. He noticed subtle signs, small nods, shifts in posture, the way groups communicated with hand signals or fleeting glances. He realized that survival wasn't about being strongest. It was about knowing whom to trust, when to move, and when to stay invisible. He approached the edge of a small group, keeping distance while listening. They whispered quietly, exchanging tips and information, a map of alliances within the yard. Marcus memorized everything, storing each detail mentally. Every group, every member, every gesture could become a lifeline or a threat. Then he noticed her, a quiet inmate, older, with eyes that seemed to see everything. She glanced at Marcus, nodding subtly. It was an acknowledgement, a silent warning. Watch your back, rookie. Nothing here is safe. Marcus realized he wasn't alone. Someone was watching, testing him. And that someone might be his ally, or the one who would push him over the edge. Suddenly, chaos erupted at the far end of the yard. A fight had broken out, sudden, violent, explosive. Marcus instinctively stepped back, trying to remain invisible. But the fight spread, drawing attention, and he found himself cornered by a trio of inmates who had been silently observing him. "You've been too quiet, new guy. We like quiet, until we don't." Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't fight them all. He remembered the lessons from yesterday: dodge, observe, blend. Using the narrow space between benches, he maneuvered carefully, letting their own movements carry him past him. A punch glanced off the bench near his shoulder. He stumbled slightly, heart pounding, but remained upright. The fight dissipated as guards blew their whistles, but Marcus could feel the lingering eyes on him. He was marked again, not as weak, but as someone who had survived. That mark could be a blessing or a curse. By evening, Marcus returned to his cell, exhausted but alert. Every nerve in his body was tuned to the yard, to the other inmates, to the shadows. The lessons were clear. Survival was mental first, physical second. He had learned to read the room, to interpret silent gestures, to predict aggression before it happened. He sat on the cot, reflecting, when he noticed the door handle rattling. A shadow appeared again, just as it had before, but this time, the tall inmate stepped fully into the light, and his expression was unreadable. Today you survived more than just yourself. You survived their tests, but tomorrow you'll see why Rikers doesn't forgive mistakes. He left as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Marcus alone with the shadows. The weight of the day pressed down on him. Every sound, every movement, every shadow now carried meaning. And then, Marcus realized the true danger at Rikers Island wasn't just the fights, the gangs, or the yard. It was the constant psychological pressure, the silent observation, the endless tension that never let a man rest. The first days had been a warning. Today had been a trial. Tomorrow, Marcus knew, would be the real test of survival. The shadows were closing in.
Marcus awoke to the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echo of footsteps outside his cell. Sleep had been shallow, fragmented by nightmares of shadows, whispers, and the faces he had seen in the yard. The first days had been lessons. The second day had been a trial. Today promised something more dangerous, a test that would push him to the edge of his endurance. As the steel door unlocked, the familiar tall inmate from the yard appeared in the corridor. His expression was unreadable, but Marcus could feel the weight of his gaze. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Today you'll see what most rookies never live long enough to experience." Marcus nodded, heart pounding. His stomach churned, but his mind sharpened. He had learned to read every shadow, anticipate every movement, and suppress fear, at least enough to survive. The yard looked deceptively calm. A thin, bluish-gray light filtered through the fences, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. Inmates moved with quiet purpose, clustering in small groups. Every eye turned toward Marcus as he stepped out, scanning, calculating, absorbing every subtle movement. The tall inmate walked alongside him, silently observing. Marcus noticed small, deliberate gestures, a hand lightly touching a shoulder, a nod between two inmates, the way someone shifted weight slightly before approaching another. These were invisible rules, lessons in survival. He had learned a little about them, but today would teach him how deep the system ran. Suddenly, a whistle pierced the quiet. A small group of inmates sprinted toward the center of the yard. Marcus's pulse quickened. They were not running for exercise. They were running for power. A shout rang out and Marcus's instincts kicked in. A fight erupted, fast, brutal, and precise. One inmate lunged at another, elbows striking, bodies colliding with concrete. Marcus dodged instinctively, ducking behind a low wall. He realized immediately, today's test wasn't just observation, it was being thrown into chaos and surviving without being consumed by it. He heard a voice from the shadows. "Move! Don't freeze!" It was the tall inmate. Marcus sprinted across the yard, weaving between groups, keeping low, letting the momentum carry him past dangerous encounters. Every glance could mark him for aggression. Every hesitation could be fatal. His muscles burned, his lungs ached, but he pushed forward, surviving through instinct and observation. By the time the guards blew the whistle, Marcus was drenched in sweat and trembling, but alive. For a moment, he allowed himself relief until he noticed the small groups observing him silently. He was being watched, every move cataloged, every breath measured. Back in his cell, Marcus slumped onto the cot, trying to steady his heartbeat. The yard had been brutal, but the real danger was invisible. The system of hierarchy, the silent observation, the ever-present tension, that was the true test of Rikers Island. Suddenly the door rattled. Marcus stiffened. A shadow appeared. The tall inmate stepped in again, but this time his expression was cold, unreadable. "You survived, but now comes the real test. A test of endurance, of will, and of fear." He left as silently as he had come, leaving Marcus alone. The silence pressed down on him, heavier than any fist, more suffocating than any shadow. Later that evening, Marcus was escorted to a smaller, dimly lit yard, separate from the main block. It was a space few saw, a proving ground for those who had survived the first layers of Rikers hierarchy.
Several inmates were already there, forming a circle. In the center, a man stepped forward, older, scarred, and clearly a veteran of the prison's darkest corridors. He looked at Marcus, then the group, and a chilling silence fell. "You've made it this far, rookie. Most don't survive 3 days." Marcus's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed to flee, but he knew that was impossible. Retreat meant death, not necessarily physical, but social, psychological, and symbolic. He had to face this. The older inmate continued, "Tonight, you'll prove whether you belong, or you'll disappear into the shadows like the rest."
The challenge began. Marcus was surrounded, pressured, tested in ways that were physical, mental, and emotional. He dodged, weaved, read subtle gestures, and anticipated movements that weren't even directed at him. Every second was life or death. Every choice, a lesson or a punishment. Hours passed. Sweat dripped down his face. His body ached. His mind raced. And yet, he survived. Through observation, strategy, and instinct, Marcus moved through the chaos without surrendering to panic. When the tall inmate stepped into the circle again, the other prisoners parted, leaving Marcus standing, battered but upright. The tall inmate approached slowly, inspecting him like a judge. "You've done well," he said. "Better than most. But remember, Rikers doesn't forgive mistakes. Every day, every moment, you're being tested. Survive the next one, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see another sunrise." Marcus exhaled, relief flooding through him. But as he turned to leave, he noticed movement in the shadows. A group of inmates lingered silently, watching, whispering, plotting. He realized that survival wasn't just physical, it was constant vigilance. He was safe for now, but not forever. Back in his cell, Marcus sat on the cot, staring at the small barred window. The moonlight cast long blue shadows across the walls. He thought about the first 5 days, the lessons learned, the fights survived, the subtle signs he had observed. Each day had chipped away at his sense of safety, teaching him that Rikers Island was more than a prison. It was a living organism, a system designed to test, break, and expose weaknesses. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to the shadow creeping across the wall. He knew that the lessons were far from over. A faint whisper drifted from the corridor. "Tomorrow, the shadows will come closer." Marcus's eyes widened. He understood the truth. Survival wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and constant. And the real test of Rikers Island was only beginning.